Okay, ERevo 2.0 fans, here it is, Jason with my ERevo 1.5, and I call it a 1.5 because it's technically got a Kershaw Design version 1 Revo chassis on it that I converted over to have a 2.1 powertrain in it, because that's definitely the best part of the new ERevo 2.0. The main reason why I'm doing this video is just to show people kind of as a tutorial. I came across a nice guy, a shout out here to Jim Lewis at jimsbearings.com, who was the first person I could find that actually had a full kit for all the bearings in an ERevo 2.0. I found out that I genuinely needed this kit because there was a guy in the ERevo 2.0 owners group that needed to know if there was any alternative for a bent dog bone on one of the new ERevos, and I kind of hinted around that maybe the MIPs would work, and it turns out after gutting this thing and finding out if they were even manageable to fit in there, it isn't even plausible because of a bunch of differences. For one, the diff has a shaft on it that's those cups are riding on that's 8 millimeters, which I don't know anything else more than what's technically capable with the ERevo version 1. But while doing so, I ended up tearing out the axles, and while taking the new axle out of the carrier, I discovered that the inner bearings on 3 out of 4 of my carriers were completely seized, not even moving in any way, shape, or form. And I was rather discouraged. I reached out to anybody in the group, and somebody pointed me in the right direction in the regular ERevo group that there's a guy that has them. So here I am about to do a tutorial on how to tear apart the front end of an ERevo 2.0. For starters, you come over here, the new ERevo, after removing the wheels, you have to get your wheel hub and put it over the 17 millimeter adapter. You gotta take the wrench here and get to the little set screw that sits in the middle, kind of like a pinion set screw is on a pinion for your drivetrain. I, for one, only backed the screw out just slightly to give me access to this new pin here that's in the middle that goes through. You probably could shim it like the version 1, where you can take out the hub and still put a little bit of shims behind it. There's definitely room for it, but I haven't noticed any wheel wobble yet, but you definitely could. But these new shafts are 8 millimeters, so you're going to have to go another route than the regular ERevo version 1s. Now here on the other side, I have to do the same. I already pre-loosened the screw, by the way. Removing the pins, pulling the hub off. Now the axle has a little bit of play in it from the carrier. I already changed out the bearings prior to this video. Now you have to remove the lower half skid plate by removing the 4 screws you see here and the one that goes through the bell crank. Now with all 4 here completely backed out, which are all the same size screws, by the way, you have to peel the first one all the way back. This one you can raise straight up, exposing the lower part of the bulkhead and the 4 stainless steel pins you see here to remove the lower 2 parts of the front A-arms. The bell crank, I would recommend at this point, kind of pull it back and get it out of the way. Now with those 4 removed, you can move the A-arms out of your way, which, by the way, that is another part that is completely compatible with the version 1. The pins are the same size. You're definitely going to have to remove the little screw you see here that holds the front of the bulkhead in place. Now with that completely removed, one of the other things I would definitely recommend at this point is to remove the 5145 screw, but it's technically not a 5145 because it's a lot thicker because of the new cups. It's about the same thing, but genuinely not the exact same thing. Now these ones, unlike the fronts, you do have the ability to actually slide them forward to get them out of the way and then remove the cup. The axle will just fall in place. I always put my screws right back in the cups just to keep them out of the way. At this point you can also pull the axle all the way forward and slip it out. Kind of hard to do one-handed. Exposing the new 8mm shaft that goes on the new diffs. Now I'm about to do the same thing on the other side. This time I'll genuinely show what I mean by it'll slide forward. Removing said set screw. Now with all that being removed, at this point I would recommend flipping it over and doing the top side. Now with the top being here, you have to definitely remove the front bumper and body brace or mount by removing that screw there, the other screw here, and the one here in the center. Okay, now with those 3 screws completely removed, you can slide forward and remove your brace entirely. Main reason why you have to remove that is the only way you can get this front part of this mount off to separate the new diffs. Exposing what my modifications to fit in the new Kershaw design chassis to fit the new bulkheads to it. And here in my hand I currently have ERevo version 1 chassis that I don't have anything on. I definitely recommend any of you trying to make the conversion with the newer chassis or without the newer chassis, with your version 1 chassis, you have to grind all that extra plastic and make this thing completely flat and flush. And then in order to compensate for this hump that's going to be there that's level, you're going to definitely have to cut into it and go almost all the way back to that center screw that's right there that's holding it in the body mount. This kind of gives you a good outline of how close you really have to get to that said screw. But now with all that there removed, you have to flip it back over, exposing the bottom of the bulkhead, which this part right here I'm a big fan of because how much of a pain it was to access the bulkheads. You actually had to remove the whole top part of the bulkhead, or in this V2 you do not no longer have to do that. You technically have to remove 6 screws, this one, and this one, and then there's 3 the same on the opposite side. Okay, now with those 6 screws completely loosened up, you literally just lift the new bulkhead lower half completely out. Didn't get one screw entirely. Exposing the new monstrous diff. It literally, like it should have always been, just comes right out, still leaving the upper half of the bulkhead intact. If you're trying to get the pinion gear out, you're definitely still going to have to do something through the bell crank or whatever to remove the new center shaft from the pinion gear that goes to the diff. Okay, now with that screw removed, that goes to the axle, you can remove the pinion gear rather easily, and it's completely solid in every way, shape, or form with two bearings that are two different sizes. Okay, I for one am a big fan of using my Mobile 1 grease, which is rather heavy, that is for wheel bearings on a real car. Hence it says wheel bearings, chassis, suspension, universal joints. Where other people will use the correct product, which I tried and true with my Monster Revo and my other Revos. I'm a big fan. I hit up all the gears. I take care of every single one of the teeth on the pinion and the gear. I try to rub it in all the housing of each part of it. I replaced all the bearing, or the two bearings that go on the diff itself. I will say one thing, having this thing in here, there is a slight bit of slop. But with these teeth being as deep cut as they really are, I mean, it's genuinely at least mod 1, if not mod 1.5. I don't see these things really having an issue of meshing with a little bit of slop, but it definitely could possibly use a shim here or there. But the inner dimension, unlike the V1, is going to have to be every bit of 8 millimeters in the center and probably like a 10 or 12 on the outside, being 2 mil difference in thickness to make sure it catches that inner race. Now with that in there and everything locked in, I'm definitely a big fan of these new bulkheads because in actuality it's rather sealed. I understand there's no bearings that or seals that go on the outer part of it, but this thing being so easily accessible like it is, unlike the first version, I'm definitely loving it in every way, shape, or form. Now at this point you basically reverse the process you've already done. You retighten down the 6 screws that you already removed to get the bottom half of the bulkhead apart, which I'm about to do so. And a little side note, I'm definitely a big fan of when you're doing particular things like this where you're screwing machine screws into plastic. I would always make sure you tighten down to where it snugs up and you feel it bite just a little bit, and maybe give it a 1/16, maybe even an 1/8 of a turn just past that point, so you don't strip out, because your threads are going into plastic. And another extra little side note, I'm a machinist by trade, and I always recommend doing things in a tightening sequence from the inside out. So definitely recommend making sure you jump around a little bit, kind of like when doing lug nuts on a car. You got to jump around, but definitely start with the center and work your way out on a 6-bolt pattern or anything greater than that. Now with all that in place, now you have to replace and put back the same stainless steel pins that are from the same V1 or V2. They're the same size in every way, shape, or form from my complete comparison. So I'm about to do that there. Now after doing that, just took a thought while putting the 4th one in. Don't do that yet. Okay, remove the 4 again. Now at this point, I recommend flipping over the chassis to expose the top again. Okay, now with the top exposed again, I would sit there and put the front bumper back in place. Nope. Sorry there, totally getting ahead of myself. Got things going on in the background. Alright, I recommend putting the bracket back over it. Definitely put the little small screw there in the center. Okay, now with that screw all the way tightened down and snugged, I'm a big fan of, this is still stock, I didn't really go through it and put all the little things, but there's these tiny little horseshoe clips that go on these rods that ride in between. If you tend on doing a lot of bashing and driving around and beating the snot out this thing, definitely make sure you could put 2 in front and 2 to the back to kind of adjust your alignment. In my experience, I always put 2 in front and 2 in back, and then do the same with the front bars that go through, just to make sure everything's kind of snug. Now at this point you grab your front bumper slash post mount or front bumper mount, whatever you want to call it, and put in the 3 screws that are removed to begin with to get to this point. Okay, now with those 3 screws back in place, the 2 front ones and the back one, by the way, the back one is the shorter one of the 3, make sure that goes in back. And another good rule of thumb, while doing things like this that require lining up in 3 or more places, I always recommend to start the screws slightly and putting in each and every screw so you can align things appropriately before you snug it completely down. Now back to the bottom half of this. In order to get this thing together, I genuinely recommend putting the axles in first, back into the carriers all the way on both sides. Making sure that they are not in the way of your turnbuckles or your steering brackets. No obstructions. Which, another good rule of thumb while doing all this here, I wouldn't tighten everything completely down while doing tightening sequences like that. I definitely go back over it one more time just to make sure, because other things can still end up being a little loose after tightening particular ones. So go back around and make sure you at least do that 16th in every way, shape, or form. Past the first little biting point. Now, having the axles back into the carriers, I'd push them all the way forward. Take your drive cups here, which are monstrous, and it fits that pin so nicely and snugly on both sides. Chances of it walking out or backing out like it used to are slim to none. I also strongly recommend you put the drive cup over the axle, then put the drive cup over your diff arm or stud axle end. Then try to get the pin in place. And if you have to, which in most cases you're going to have to, always make sure you can access your axle in some way, shape, or form. So you can spin it, so you can access the holes in an easier fashion. I'm going to tighten this down and then do the same thing on the other side. Okay, now with that completely tightened down, I know a lot of people like using their Loctite, but most Loctite says that it's supposed to work and cure for a 24-hour period of time. I'm doing this just for this tutorial video and save some time, but in all honesty, I'm a bigger fan of using thread tape for pipes, because it works a lot better. You don't have to reuse it, you don't have to wait as long, and I'm generally not a really patient person to really begin with. And I can go back through, if done right, going around 3 or 4 entire times, and then the tail end of it going in the hole with the tip of the pin definitely works very well. Always make sure you're going the opposite way of the threads that are going inwards, so it doesn't automatically bunch up and back completely off. Okay, just like the other side, at this point I'm going to gotta remove the pin, hold on. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing I did with the other side with the pin out, put it back over the dog bone, get it back over here, turn it around so I can expose the thread side. One of the nice things about these steel drive cups versus any form of plastic axle, that you actually can go rather tight. I recommend, if using Loctite, going all the way in and backing off about a 1/8 of a turn, maybe even a 1/16 of a turn, so you don't damage the inside and leave a indent or impression on the inner shaft that the cup is attaching itself to. Okay, now I can do the 4 stainless steel pins that are from the ERevo version 1 to get these lower parts of the 8 arms in place. Okay, now with those 4 in place, you basically put the skid guards back in place. You have to put this one in first, which means I have to move the turnbuckle back forward to make sure. Oops, sorry, forgot this is going to be a funky angle. You have to make sure you're back riding on that for the bearing on the bell crank, not turnbuckle. Make sure you get that pin good and lined up. Okay, pins lined up, screws lined up in the hole appropriately. I like to tighten that one down first because it's kind of a pivot point. Sorry for the camera angle there, forgot I got the phone in my hand. Okay, now with that one kind of started, I'm going to do those ones right afterwards, but not forgetting to put the front bumper / skid plate in place. I recommend tipping it forward to get it in place. Watch out you don't pop them screws and lose them. Okay, now with that all back in place and the axles in the way they are, you're going to have to get these back in place. Hold on, let me turn this axle. I don't want this thing to be exactly side by side because then the pin will completely fall through. But line up the hole, grab your steel pin, which is definitely a better concept than the original where the pin didn't rest in there with this new set screw. Okay, make sure you get this thing where it's pretty much flush on both sides, because remember your axle, or I mean your wheel rim, is going to go over that and it's going to catch on it and chew up the insides of it and make it slip. So you definitely want this thing rather centered and not exposed too far on the ends, the pin being, or meaning the pin. Okay, now with that snugged a little bit, at this point I definitely would recommend putting this back over it, getting your wrench back inside there to access the little set screw that goes in there, and using that to hold this thing completely in place so you can snug it all the way up. Definitely use Loctite or the thread tape that I've mentioned before, because you definitely don't want that pin to go away, but it's definitely a lot easier to get pins like that, maybe even the steel pin that goes in these things now, unlike the old pins that used to fall out and you'd have to sit there and chase them around or find them or find a substitute. Okay, now with that being done, definitely make sure while you're at this point that you have the ability to lay your chassis flat, upside down or right side up. Upside down is how I have it now. That your carrier is definitely running parallel or perpendicular, shall I say, with the surface that you're on right now, because otherwise your wheels can be wompy. Check those ball screws, which I'm a big fan of the plastic ones, in the little rubber boot that has access so you can adjust at any point in time through your wheels without having to remove your entire rim. But make sure they're all good. Now I'm going to continue and start on the rear. Okay, here with the rear side of the 2.0, you only really have to remove the 2 screws. Yeah, there's probably other screws over there that you have to remove, but I'm not really getting into that. But there's just the 2 for me. Okay, now with removing this rear skid plate, it relatively is about the same layout as the front. Once again, you're going to have to remove the pins that you did in the front, but unlike the front, on this rear part of the buckle, hold on, you're going to have to remove this little triangular bracket that has that center screw that holds the bulk brace, I want to call it, in place. I'm going to do that now. Okay, removing that screw all the way. And removing the little bracket that I mentioned earlier. It's a little triangle. I always try to personally keep screws with parts because then they don't disappear as easily. Now again, just like the front that I did earlier, you got to remove the 4 pins that are all the same size and the same as the ones from the version 1 Revo. I'm about to do that now. Okay, now with those pins removed, you can open up the A-arms and the axles will technically move right out of the way because you have more travel in the rear. That's kind of why one guy has mentioned that he had an issue where he had the dog bone actually pop out in the rear. And one of the guys mentioned in the Revo group, which is a buddy of mine, that if you're having that issue or have that issue, you can always screw the pillow balls all the way in, because see, there is still space on mine, but I don't have an issue. And then when they're in, there's technically not really that much travel. There's no way that this is going up far enough for that to completely pop up, because I mean, just look how much you would have to really get and travel in order to do that. I mean, I'm pushing this thing way past the limit. The wheel would be outward so far it wouldn't even be funny. Okay, just like I did with the front, I'm gonna have to remove the little cups. Or no, I don't have to remove the cups on this one technically. I could keep them in place, but I'm gonna do it for the tutorial anyways. Okay, now with the pins up and out of the way, the rear axles that go to the diff are same 8mm as the front. The diffs in every way, shape, or form, from what I can tell, front to back, are the same exact build, only the bulkheads are different, just like the ERevo version 1. Same thing as the front. There's 6 screws here. You have to loosen all 6 of those. I'm about to do that now. Okay, now with all those screws completely backed out, just like the front. Oh, nope. I'm going to have to go to the other side, so I'm going to slightly put these screws in just a little bit so they don't fall out and I don't lose them. Okay, with those snug back down, just like the front, you have to do the top at this point. Hold on. Okay, now from the top, you have to remove the same 3 screws that you technically did on the front. Oh yeah, by the way, thank you to Ronald, I don't know, Glover, I'm sorry man if I slaughter your name, but at Mamba Racing Cat Packs, or the lovely racing snake bite cat pack that I have here. But you have to remove the 1 screw down there below the brace. You're going to have to remove the other screw there and that one down there. That one's going to be the tricky one because technically you got to remove the brace. I don't use the original Revo 2.0 brace. I rather use the aluminum because it's not plastic, it's not going to break, and there's guys that have already broke the thing. So I'm going to remove these screws here, which all 3 screws should be the same size. With me using the aluminum brace from the ERevo version 1, I learned a little trick a long time ago, getting sick and tired of having to try to find a way to get down there with a smaller Allen wrench. I personally raised this aluminum brace up so I can change the angle of the wrench to get down there and actually get at that screw. I'm going to have to put the phone down and readjust. Alright, here we go. I get this wrench in there at an angle down to it. Yes, I know if I had a ball screw end it'd be a lot easier, but I like using what came with it. I like the cheap Traxxas original set because I can get it. It's relatively inexpensive, and when I do fresh builds or remove things, I normally use the fresh brand new set of wrenches to do the final snugging of things and removing of things so I don't strip anything out. It's cheap and inexpensive and it works. Alright, now with that screw completely backed out and removed, The name finally came to me. It's Ronald Glover D'Amico, I want to say, at Mamba Racing Cat Packs on Facebook. Guy out of Florida. Nice cat packs, all different kinds, from 1S all the way up to 12S. Great price, quick shipper, hasn't let anybody down as far as I know. And once again, here with the Kershaw, I ended up cutting all this area out on it all the way to that screw that's there in the center. You will have to do the same probably if you try to convert a version 1 to a version 2 Revo in parts. And the same thing with this, as I explained on the front, you're going to have to do with the rear part with the chassis. With the chassis that has the humps, you're going to have to definitely cut that same space out, because these screw holes are all the same. You're going to have to get all the way to that center hole and cut a good gouge out like I did right there. But as for the alignment with the Kershaw being completely flat and this not being completely flat, you're going to have to grind all that out to make room and make it flush with the bottom. You don't have to technically go completely all the way past to where that little hump is, but genuinely kind of go the same amount, because I have perfect clearance on a flat spot without that hump that will not affect it. Sorry about that. At this point, I'm going to flip it back over because I'm done with the top half of this. Okay, now with this thing completely flipped back over, you can remove those screws that I loosened up earlier. Now, before I technically removed it, I'm definitely a big fan that Traxxas actually left a little hole where you can sit there and technically remove your center shaft if you had to. I don't really have the access that everybody else has in their center, but it is a nice convenience. Now, at this point, I'm going to pull this up and out of the way. Or not so. Got ahead of myself as usual. You have to remove the front, or I mean rear, 2 screws here that go to the rear face of the bulkhead with this bulkhead brace. I'm about to do that. Okay, with those screws completely backed out, I'm definitely a big fan of keeping screws with things in place so you don't lose them so easily. Now you can remove the top half.